Obi lived in a small village with his wife, Ada. He was a hunter, spending his days in the thick forests that surrounded their home. Ada was a quiet, hard-working woman, tending to the small garden in their backyard and managing their modest hut. Their lives were simple but peaceful. They had little, but they were content. One evening, while Obi was deep in the forest hunting, he found a woman lying on the ground. She was covered in dirt, her clothes torn, and she looked as though she had been wandering for days. Without thinking twice, Obi lifted her and carried her back home. When Obi brought the woman into their home, Ada's heart sank. She couldn't hide her discomfort. The woman, whose name was Bisi, had a strange presence about her. Ada couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but Obi insisted that Bisi was lost and needed their help. Ada kept quiet, but deep down she didn't trust the stranger who now lay in their home. The next day, as the sun rose over the village, Obi prepared to go hunting. He grabbed his bow and arrows and turned to Ada, telling her he would return before nightfall. Ada, her mind still uneasy, asked if she could go with him. She didn't want to be left alone with Bisi, but Obi assured her there was nothing to fear. He told her to stay home and rest, promising to be back soon. Reluctantly, Ada watched her husband leave, disappearing into the forest. She was left alone with Bisi, whose presence made the air in their home feel heavy. Ada tried to distract herself by tending to her garden in the backyard, but the thoughts of what she had seen the night before plagued her mind. She had seen something in Bisi's room, something unnatural, something that should not be. As Ada knelt in the garden, pulling weeds from the small patch of vegetables, she felt a chill run down her spine. She could sense someone watching her. Slowly she turned around, and there stood Bisi, her dark eyes fixed on Ada. Bisi's expression was cold, her face emotionless, but her eyes burned with a strange intensity. Stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Ada's heart began to race. She knew what she had seen last night, Bisi's true form, her body transforming into a snake. Ada had been too afraid to speak of it, but now the truth stood before her. Bisi knew. "You should have minded your business." Bisi's voice was low, filled with malice. "You saw what you weren't supposed to see, and now I won't spare you." Ada's blood ran cold. She tried to move, to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Bisi's body began to change. Her legs twisted together, growing longer, transforming into the massive, scaly form of a serpent. Her eyes glowed yellow, her mouth widened into a sinister smile, and her skin shimmered as the transformation completed. Before Ada could scream, Bisi lunged forward. The giant snake coiled around her, squeezing her body with unimaginable strength. Ada struggled, gasping for breath, but the more she fought, the tighter the snake's grip became. Ada's vision blurred, her strength fading with each passing moment. Her body grew limp in the snake's grasp, and with one final squeeze, Bisi ended her life. After the dark deed, Bisi slithered away from the scene, her serpent form gone, and left the house as though nothing had happened. Bisi walked into the village market, her face calm and composed, as if her hands were clean. She smiled at the vendors, exchanged greetings with the women buying and selling food, blending into the crowd as though she had not just killed Ada in cold blood. Her disguise was flawless. No one suspected anything unusual about her. She wandered from stall to stall, pretending to be just another villager going about her day. Meanwhile, back in the forest, Obi was focused on his hunt when a strange feeling washed over him. It was as if the wind had whispered to him that something was terribly wrong. His heart raced and a chill crept up his spine. It wasn't a normal feeling. He had spent years in the forest, trusting his instincts, and this time they were screaming at him to go home. Without hesitating, Obi abandoned his hunt and hurried back to the village. His feet moved quickly, but the sense of dread grew with each step. By the time he reached his home, he was out of breath, but there was no relief waiting for him. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was no sign of Bisi or Ada. Panic set in as Obi rushed inside, calling for his wife. No answer. He searched every room, but the house was empty. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the backyard. There, in the garden, he found Ada. She lay motionless on the ground, her body lifeless, her skin pale. Obi dropped to his knees, shaking her, hoping she was still alive, but her body was cold. His hands trembled as he looked at her, unable to understand what had happened. Desperate to save her, Obi scooped Ada's body into his arms and ran as fast as he could to the village healer. The healer was an elderly man who had treated the village for many years, known for his wisdom and knowledge of both natural and spiritual remedies. Obi laid Ada down, begging the healer to save her. The healer examined Ada carefully, his face growing more serious with every moment. He finally looked up at Obi, shaking his head slowly. He explained that it was too late. Ada was already gone. She had been bitten by a dangerous snake, and the venom had spread through her body, killing her. Obi was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The village had never had a problem with snakes. In fact, snakes were rare in their area. People didn't die from snake bites, and to make it worse, nobody had ever seen a snake as deadly as this one. The healer, too, was puzzled, saying he had never encountered such a thing before. Something about it felt unnatural, like there was more to this than just an unfortunate accident. Devastated, Obi returned home. His heart was heavy with grief, and his mind was filled with questions. As he approached the house, he saw Bisi sitting on the porch, tears streaming down her face. She was crying as if she had just learned terrible news. Obi, still reeling from what he had just discovered, looked at Bisi in confusion. He hadn't told anyone about Ada's death yet, and Bisi wasn't even home when he found her. He hadn't said a word. How could she possibly know? Obi asked Bisi why she was crying. Through her sobs, Bisi replied that she was mourning Ada's death. This took Obi by surprise. He stared at her, his mind racing. How did she know? He hadn't told anyone yet, and he was certain Bisi had been at the market when he came home. He asked her how she found out. Bisi quickly lied, saying that she had heard the news from the women at the market. They had supposedly told her about Ada's death while she was shopping, but something about her story didn't sit right with Obi. He looked at her closely, his mind replaying the events of the day. Bisi had left the house before he discovered Ada's body. She couldn't have possibly known what had happened before he did. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Obi's suspicion grew as he stared at Bisi. How could the market women know about Ada's death if it had just happened? No one else had seen Ada's body except him. The healer was the only other person who knew, and he hadn't told anyone yet either. As Bisi continued to cry, something about her tears felt false. Obi's mind began to connect the dots. He remembered the strange feeling he had that morning in the forest, the unusual signs that something was wrong. And now, here was Bisi, already knowing about his wife's death before anyone else. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. A few days later, the time came to bury Ada. Obi gathered a small group of family members and close friends to say their final goodbyes. But not everyone came. Many of the villagers, including some of Obi's own family, had warned him about Bisi when he first brought her home. They had told him that something about her wasn't right, that there was a darkness surrounding her. But Obi had brushed off their concerns. He had believed that Bisi was just a lost woman in need of help, and he hadn't wanted to listen to anyone else. Now, many of those who had warned him refused to attend the burial. They were angry with him. They felt that he had ignored their advice, and now Ada had paid the price. Some whispered behind his back, saying that if only Obi had listened, his wife would still be alive. Others didn't even bother to whisper, their cold stares and absence at the burial saying more than words ever could. The burial was a small, somber affair. The air was thick with sorrow, and the few people who did attend stood in silence as Obi lowered Ada's body into the ground. His heart was heavy with grief. After the burial of his wife Ada, Obi tried to return to his normal life, but things had changed. His heart was still heavy with sorrow, and the empty space Ada left behind was impossible to ignore. Yet in the middle of his grief, something else began to stir. Bisi, who had remained in his home, started to get closer to him. At first, Obi tried to keep his distance. He was still mourning Ada and couldn't imagine falling in love again so soon. But Bisi was always there, offering comfort, speaking softly, and telling him things he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. She began to tell him that she loved him, that she was the one who truly cared for him, and that Ada's death had been fate. At first, Obi resisted her words. How could he love someone so soon after losing his wife? But Bisi was persistent. She cooked for him, took care of the house, and made herself a part of his daily life. Slowly, Obi's heart began to soften toward her. He told himself that maybe he deserved to be happy again. And before long, Obi found himself madly in love with Bisi. The more time Obi spent with Bisi, the more his life seemed to improve. His hunting trips to the forest became more successful. Where once he would come back with just a few animals, now he returned with his hands full of game. Deer, antelope, and wild boar all seemed to come to him with ease. Obi would take the animals to the village market and sell them, making a lot of money. It wasn't long before he became one of the wealthiest men in the village. His hut was now filled with the spoils of his success, and the villagers began to take notice. People who had once cursed Obi for bringing Bisi into the village, who had refused to attend Ada's burial, now came to him with open hands. They came asking for help, for loans, and for favors. At first, Obi didn't know what to do. He still remembered how they had turned their backs on him when he needed them most. But he also knew the struggles of living in the village. He was tempted to help them, to show them that he was not the man they thought he was. But Bisi, who had grown even closer to Obi, warned him against it. She told him never to give his money to anyone. She whispered in his ear that those people had not cared about him when Ada died, that they had mocked him behind his back. Now that he had wealth, they only wanted to take advantage of him. Bisi's words were like poison, slowly seeping into Obi's thoughts. She convinced him that no one in the village was truly his friend, that they only wanted what he had worked so hard to earn. Obi listened to her. Each time someone came to his door, asking for a loan or a favor, he turned them away. At first it felt strange to refuse, but soon it became easier. Obi had Bisi by his side, and she made him believe that they didn't need anyone else. Together, they had all the wealth and happiness they could ever want. The villagers began to grumble, some whispering that Obi had changed, that the strange woman he lived with had turned him into a different man. But Obi didn't care. He was richer than he had ever been, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerful. He had Bisi, who seemed to bring him nothing but good fortune, and he had more money than he knew what to do with. The warnings of the villagers, the suspicions they had about Bisi, all faded into the background. Obi was too blinded by his newfound love and success to see the dark shadow growing over his life. Whenever Obi prepared to go hunting in the mornings, something strange started to happen. Bisi would always stop him before he left, asking him to wait a few hours. At first, Obi didn't think much of it. She would tell him that he needed to be patient, that going too early wouldn't bring him the success he wanted. Then Bisi would go into her room, lock the door, and tell Obi never to come in, no matter what. Obi found it strange, but didn't ask too many questions. He trusted Bisi and believed her when she said it was for his own good. Behind that locked door, Bisi would transform into a massive snake, her true form. She would slither out through a hidden hole in the wall, unnoticed by anyone. Once in the forest, she would head straight to the spot where Obi usually set his traps. There, she would use her powerful snake form to kill animals like deer, wild boar, and rabbits, making sure they fell into Obi's traps. Hours later, after completing her task, Bisi would return home and transform back into her human form. She would unlock the door and tell Obi it was time for him to go hunting. Obi, without knowing what had just happened, would grab his gear and head into the forest. When he reached his traps, he was always amazed at how full they were. Every time he went, there were more animals than the last trip. Deer caught in snares, rabbits tangled in nets, and wild boar stuck in pits, all ready for him to take home. At first, Obi didn't think much of it. He believed he was just having good luck, that maybe his skills as a hunter were improving. The more animals he caught, the more money he made at the market. People would rush to buy his fresh meat, and his wealth continued to grow. Soon, Obi was the richest man in the village, and people marveled at how quickly his fortunes had changed. But something strange was happening, and deep down, Obi knew it. In the past, hunting was difficult. Some days he would come home with nothing, and other days with just 1 or 2 animals. But now, every time he checked his traps, they were overflowing with game. It didn't make sense, but he didn't want to question it. All he cared about was the money he was making. The market women loved his meat, and he had more than enough to sell. Bisi, watching him from the shadows, smiled as her plan unfolded. She knew Obi was too blinded by his newfound success to see what was really happening. Each time he went hunting, Bisi made sure his traps were full before he even set foot in the forest. And as long as Obi didn't question how it was all happening, her secret was safe. The villagers continued to whisper about Obi's sudden wealth, but he ignored them. He told himself that hard work and skill had brought him success, and he didn't need anyone else's approval. One day, when Obi had gone out to the market, a nosy neighbor named Madaru came to Bisi's house. Madaru was known in the village for sticking his nose into other people's business, always asking questions and spreading gossip. This time, he came straight to Bisi with a look of suspicion on his face. He knocked on the door and waited, arms crossed, as Bisi opened it and stood quietly in the doorway. Without wasting time, Madaru began talking. He told Bisi that he knew who she really was. He claimed that the gods had revealed her true identity to him in a vision. He said that she wasn't an ordinary woman, but a snake in disguise, a creature sent to the village with some dark purpose. Madaru didn't know yet what her mission was, but he warned her that the gods would not allow her to harm the village. His words were sharp, filled with accusations, as he called her names and insulted her. He even said that it was no wonder strange things had been happening since she arrived. Bisi stood there silently, her face calm, as Madaru's words poured out. She didn't respond, didn't argue or defend herself. She simply watched him with cold, dark eyes, her expression unchanged. Madaru took her silence as proof that he was right. He puffed up with pride, thinking he had exposed her secret. After throwing a few more insults her way, Madaru left, stomping down the road, muttering to himself about how he would uncover her true plans soon. 2 days passed after Madaru's visit, and life in the village continued as usual. But then something unexpected happened. Madaru went to his farm, as he did every day, to check on his crops. The sun was high, and the air was hot and dry. As Madaru walked between the rows of his crops, inspecting his plants, he suddenly froze in his tracks. There, right in front of him, a large snake appeared, coiled and ready to strike. Before he could move or cry out, the snake lunged forward and bit him on the leg, screamed in pain, stumbling backward and clutching his leg where the snake's fangs had sunk deep into his flesh. The venom spread quickly through his body, and within minutes he collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. By the time some villagers heard his cries and rushed to help, it was too late. Madaru was already dead. Word of Madaru's death spread through the village like wildfire. People were shocked and afraid. Snakes were not common in their village, and no one could remember the last time anyone had been bitten, let alone killed by one. The villagers gathered in small groups, gossiping about what happened. Some people began to panic, thinking that something evil had come to their village. The strange events that had been happening ever since Obi brought Bisi into his home suddenly seemed connected. First, Ada had died from a snake bite, even though no snakes were known to live in their village. Now Madaru, who had openly accused Bisi of being a snake, was dead too, killed by a snake in broad daylight. It was all too much for the villagers to ignore. Rumors started flying. People whispered that Bisi must be cursed, that she had brought bad luck and misfortune to their once peaceful village. Some even said that she was a witch, using dark powers to control Obi and bring death to anyone who opposed her. Others believed that the gods were angry and had sent snakes as a punishment for something the village had done. The villagers had had enough. They gathered together and decided to take their concerns to the king. They believed only the king could put an end to the strange things happening in their village. A group of elders, along with some of the most respected villagers, went to the palace to seek justice. When they arrived, they explained everything to the king: the sudden deaths, the strange rumors about Bisi, and the fear that had gripped the village. They pleaded with the king to do something about Bisi before it was too late. The king listened to their concerns and agreed that something needed to be done. He sent a messenger to summon Bisi to the palace. When Bisi arrived at the king's court, she appeared calm and graceful, as though none of the villagers' accusations bothered her. The king took one look at her, and to the surprise of everyone present, was immediately taken by her beauty and charm. He liked her instantly, and any plans to investigate the strange events in the village faded from his mind. The villagers, who had been hoping the king would question Bisi and get to the bottom of things, were shocked. Instead of confronting her or asking about the deaths, The king welcomed her kindly and didn't seem to believe the rumors. He even praised her for her poise and composure, saying she didn't look like someone capable of such evil. Bisi left the palace unharmed, returning to Obi's house with no punishment or accusations. The villagers, frustrated and confused, returned home, unsure of what to do next. They had hoped the king would take action, but now it seemed like they were back where they started, with no answers and even more fear. When Bisi got home, Obi was waiting for her. He had heard all the rumors swirling around the village, and although he had tried to ignore them, they were becoming harder to dismiss. He couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't right. When he saw Bisi, he finally gathered the courage to ask her about the rumors. He wanted to know if any of them were true. Were people really dying because of her? Was she connected to the strange snake bites? Bisi, seeing the worry in Obi's eyes, burst into tears. She cried and told him that it was all lies. She said the villagers were only trying to ruin her, that they were jealous of how much Obi loved her and how successful they had become. She insisted that she had done nothing wrong and that all the deaths were just terrible accidents. Obi, who still cared deeply for Bisi, was torn. He didn't want to believe the worst about her. He remembered how happy she had made him and how his life had changed for the better since she came into it. Her tears and words softened his heart, and once again he found himself believing her. He told himself that the villagers were just superstitious and looking for someone to blame. Soon Bisi began secretly visiting the king behind Obi's back. She would sneak out whenever Obi was away at the market or in the forest, going to the palace to see the king. The king had become even more enchanted by her since their first meeting, and their meetings became more frequent. Bisi was careful to keep it hidden from Obi, but secrets like that are hard to keep forever. One day, Obi heard whispers in the village. People were talking about how Bisi had been seen visiting the palace regularly. At first, he didn't want to believe it, but the rumors grew louder. Soon, even his friends were warning him that something wasn't right. Obi couldn't ignore it any longer. When he confronted Bisi, he asked her directly if what he had been hearing was true. Had she been seeing the king behind his back? Bisi, as usual, tried to deny it. She turned on the tears, claiming it was all just more lies spread by the villagers who hated her. But this time, Obi wasn't so easily convinced. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind, and he began to wonder if Bisi had been hiding more from him than he realized. They had a big fight that night. Throughout that entire month, something strange also happened in the forest. No matter how hard Obi tried, he couldn't catch any animals in his traps. Every time he went hunting, the traps were empty. This had never happened before, and it made Obi even more suspicious. He started to wonder if there was a connection between Bisi and his hunting success. Could it be that she was somehow controlling the animals in the forest, filling his traps before, and now, because of their fight, she had stopped? The more Obi thought about it, the more it made sense. Ever since Bisi had entered his life, his fortunes had changed. He had become rich, his traps had been full, and the villagers were afraid of her. But now, after their argument, it was as if his luck had run out. No animals, no wealth, no success. It was all too strange to be a coincidence. One day, after weeks of tension, Obi apologized to Bisi, hoping to make things right. And just like that, the next time he went hunting, his traps were full again. The forest seemed alive with animals, and Obi couldn't ignore the strange connection anymore. It was as if Bisi had the power to control his fate. The thought made him uneasy, but he kept it to himself, unsure of what to do. Meanwhile, in the palace, the queen had also heard the rumors about her husband's affair with Bisi. It was no secret that the king had been acting strangely ever since Bisi started visiting. The queen confronted the king, demanding to know if the rumors were true. She asked him directly if he had been seeing Bisi in secret. The king, not wanting to admit the truth, denied everything. He told the queen that there was nothing between him and Bisi, that people were simply spreading rumors to cause trouble. He insisted that Bisi was just a villager, and that there was no reason for the queen to worry. But the queen wasn't convinced. She had seen the way the king looked at Bisi and knew there was more to the story than he was admitting. Despite the king's denial, the rumors continued to spread. The village was buzzing with gossip, and both the king and Obi were caught in the middle of it. Bisi's influence over both men was growing, and everyone could see it. The once peaceful village was now divided by suspicion, lies, and fear. One afternoon, the Queen, unable to tolerate the rumors any longer, decided to visit Obi. She had heard enough whispers about Bissie's involvement with the king and knew she needed to confront the situation directly. Arriving at Obi's house, the Queen spoke in a firm voice, demanding that Obi warn Bissie to stay away from her husband. She was tired of the rumors, tired of the lies, and she would not let Bissie ruin her marriage. Bissie, who had been nearby, overheard the conversation from the other room. She listened quietly as the Queen issued her warning, a cold smile creeping across her face. She did not react or confront the Queen at that moment, but in her mind plans were already forming. She would not allow anyone, not even the Queen, to stand in her way. A few days later, tragedy struck the palace. The Queen, who had been healthy and strong, suddenly slumped to the ground while in her chambers. Her servants rushed to her side, but it was too late. She died quickly and without explanation. The village was shocked. Whispers filled the air once again, and many began to suspect that Bissie had something to do with the Queen's sudden death, but no one dared to speak it aloud. A few weeks after the Queen's death, the king gathered his closest advisers and kingsmen. In a surprising announcement, he declared that he planned to marry Bissie. The news sent shockwaves through the village. Everyone knew that the king had only recently lost his queen, and for him to marry so soon, and to Bissie of all people, was unthinkable. Yet despite the surprise, no one dared to question the king's decision. His word was law, and no one had the courage to challenge him, not even his closest advisers. When Obi heard the news, he was filled with rage and confusion. He couldn't believe that Bissie, the woman he had brought into his home, was now set to marry the king. The thought of losing her to the king was unbearable, and so, filled with anger, he confronted her. He demanded answers, asking her how she could betray him like this. Bissie, as always, remained calm. She told Obi not to worry, that everything was part of her plan. She asked Obi if he wasn't interested in something greater, something more powerful than what he had now. Obi, still angry but curious, asked her what she meant. She looked him in the eyes and asked if he wasn't interested in becoming the king himself one day. Obi was surprised by the question, said yes. Of course, the thought of being king had crossed his mind, but he didn't understand how that was even possible. Bissie smiled and told him to be patient, that soon he would understand. She assured him that everything was under control and that all he had to do was stay quiet and trust her. Though Obi still didn't fully understand what Bissie had in mind, her words stirred something inside him. The idea of becoming king, of having power and control, excited him. Bissie, meanwhile, was already planning her next move. She had woven herself deep into the lives of both Obi and the king, and now she was on the verge of achieving something far greater than either man could imagine. All she needed was time, and as long as Obi remained loyal to her, her plans would soon unfold. Obi, though still confused and filled with doubt, agreed to stay quiet. He didn't know exactly what Bissie was planning, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, something that would change everything. Some of the villagers, unsettled by the sudden rise of Bissie and the strange things happening in the village, decided to seek help from the village priest. They were afraid of Bissie, but they knew that the village priest, with his wisdom and connection to the gods, might be able to shed light on who or what she really was. So a group of them gathered their courage and made their way to the priest's shrine. When they arrived, the priest, an old man who had served the village for many years, welcomed them with a serious look on his face. He could sense their fear and worry. The villagers explained everything, the strange deaths, the gossip, and how Bissie was now going to marry the king. They begged the priest to use his powers to find out the truth about her and help them stop whatever evil she was bringing to their village. But to their shock, the priest's face darkened. He looked more fearful than they had ever seen him. He told them that he could not reveal anything about Bissie, not because he didn't know, but because even speaking about her would bring great danger. The priest trembled as he warned them that Bissie was no ordinary woman. She was far too powerful, and no one could stop her mission. Not yet, at least. The villagers left the shrine feeling helpless. Even the priest, the man they thought could save them, was too afraid to do anything. Meanwhile, back in the village, the king went ahead with his plans and married Bissie. The ceremony was grand, with all the kingsmen and chiefs present. The village was filled with whispers, but no one dared speak out against the king's decision. Bisi, now queen, had secured her place in the palace, and her influence over the king only grew stronger. Obi watched all of this in silence. Though Bisi had told him to trust her, it still hurt to see the woman he once loved marry the king. As the days went by, he tried to keep a low profile, but not everyone in the village was so kind. One of Obi's neighbors, a man who had never liked him, came to his house just to mock him. The neighbor laughed at Obi, calling him a foolish man for allowing the king to take his woman right in front of him. He jeered at Obi, saying he should have been more careful instead of trusting someone like Bisi. Obi, filled with anger and shame, listened as the neighbor continued to insult him. The words stung, but deep down, Obi knew there was nothing he could do. He had chosen to believe in Bisi, and now everything was slipping out of his control. Even though Bisi had promised him something greater, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost everything. As the neighbor walked away, still laughing at him, Obi sat quietly, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He couldn't help but think back to when things were simple, before Bisi came into his life. Now everything had changed, and he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to face what was coming. Now that Bisi was queen, her power in the village grew even stronger. She wasted no time in making her influence known. One day, she sent for the very villagers who had gone to see the village priest. They came to the palace, trembling with fear, not knowing why they were called. When they arrived, Bisi didn't waste any words. She warned them to be careful and told them she knew exactly where they had gone and what they had asked the priest. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were cold and dangerous. The villagers were shocked. How did she know they had gone to the priest? None of them had spoken a word to anyone. Fear gripped their hearts as they realized just how powerful Bisi truly was. On their way home, they were silent, too scared to say anything. Once they were out of earshot, they made a vow. They swore never to speak of Bisi again, not to each other, not to anyone. From that day, they lived in fear, pretending everything was normal, but inside they knew Bisi was watching. Meanwhile, Bisi continued her manipulation of the king. One evening, as they sat together in the royal chambers, she told the king that she had an idea. She suggested that Obi, her former husband, be made the head of the palace guards. She praised Obi's strength and loyalty, saying he would be perfect for the role. Under her spell, the king didn't argue. He agreed without hesitation, trusting Bisi's judgment completely. The news spread quickly through the village, and many people, especially the elders, were so angry. They couldn't understand why the king would make such a decision, especially when they all knew about Bisi and Obi's past. It didn't sit well with them. The elders gathered and decided to approach the king. They wanted him to rethink his decision, to be cautious about putting Obi in such a powerful position. When the elders went to the palace and expressed their concerns, the king was furious. He stood up and warned them to mind their own business. He told them that he loved his wife, Bisi, and trusted her completely. He didn't care what anyone thought about Obi's appointment. The elders, shocked by the king's outburst, had no choice but to leave quietly. They were deeply troubled, but there was nothing they could do. The king was blinded by his love for Bisi, and no one dared to challenge him further. As time passed, it became clear to everyone that Bisi was the one pulling the strings in the palace. The king did whatever she asked without question, and the villagers grew more fearful of her by the day. The once peaceful village was now a place of whispers, secrets, and fear. No one dared cross Bisi, and those who had tried were either dead or too scared to speak. Obi, now the head of the guards, was unsure what to make of his new position. He knew that Bisi was behind it, but he still didn't fully understand her plans. All he could do was follow along, hoping that whatever she had promised him would one day come true. But deep down, a part of him still wondered if he was being led down a path he couldn't escape. One night, as Obi lay in his room, Bisi appeared at his door. Her eyes glowed with a strange light, and her voice was smooth and commanding. She told Obi to follow her to the king's bedroom. Confused, Obi asked why. Bisi smiled and told him that the king was not home, and this was his chance to be closer to her in ways that would bring him more power. "Don't you want to become king?" she whispered. Obi looked at her, his mind racing. She explained her plan. If he continued to sleep with her in the king's bed, the king would eventually become sick, and with time he would die. The king had no children, so when he died, Bisi would marry Obi, making him the new king. Obi was excited by the thought of becoming king, a dream he had never imagined could be so close. He accepted Bisi's plan without hesitation. From that night on, whenever the king was away, Obi would sneak into the king's bedroom and sleep with Bisi. He believed her words, thinking that this was the path to greatness. Days turned into weeks, and soon enough, the king began to fall ill. The sickness seemed to come from nowhere, and the healers in the village were puzzled. No treatment seemed to work, and the king's condition worsened every day. The villagers, unaware of what was happening behind palace walls, began to worry about the future of the kingdom. After a few months of suffering, the king passed away. The village mourned, but Bisi wasted no time. She quickly positioned herself as the one in power, declaring herself ruler since the king had left no heir. The villagers, though shocked by her boldness, were too afraid to speak against her. With the king gone, Bisi's grip on the village became stronger than ever. Obi, however, was furious. This was not the plan. He had been promised that he would be king, but now it seemed that Bisi had no intention of following through. Anger and betrayal burned inside him, and one night he confronted Bisi. He demanded to know why she had gone back on her word. He wanted to be king, just as she had promised. Bisi, unfazed by his anger, looked at him with a cold smile. Without warning, her body began to change. Right before Obi's eyes, Bisi transformed into a massive snake, her scales glistening in the dim light. She slithered toward him, her eyes glowing with a deadly light. Obi backed away in fear, his heart pounding in his chest. As quickly as she had transformed, Bisi shifted back into her human form. She stood before Obi, calm and powerful. She told him the truth. She was not just a woman. She was a demon sent to destroy the village. All the strange deaths, including his wife Ada's, had been her doing. She was responsible for the chaos that had taken over the village. Obi was frozen in fear. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Bisi then warned him, her voice cold and sharp. If he ever tried to tell anyone what she had done or who she truly was, he would join his wife in the grave. Obi, shaking with fear, knew that Bisi was not making idle threats. He was trapped, powerless against her. From that moment on, Obi lived in constant fear. He could no longer see a way out. Bisi, now the ruler of the village, had everything in her control. Her plans had unfolded perfectly, and there was nothing Obi could do to stop her. All he could do was live in silence, knowing that he had been used in her evil scheme. One day, not long after Bisi had taken full control of the village, a young man arrived at the palace gates. He was dressed simply, with the calm presence of someone who had seen and understood much more than his age suggested. When he was allowed into the palace, he introduced himself as Prince Moses, the rightful heir to the throne. Bisi was shocked. She had always believed that the king had no children, that his line ended with his death. But here was a man claiming to be the king's son. Her mind raced as she tried to process the situation. The elders were immediately called to the palace. Two of them, wise and old, confirmed that Prince Moses was indeed the son of the late king. They explained that the former king had kept his son's identity hidden because of the many enemies in the village who had long coveted the throne. By keeping his son's existence a secret, the king had hoped to protect him from harm. Bisi's face grew dark with anger as the truth unraveled. She had worked so hard, manipulated and schemed her way into power, only to have it all threatened by a prince she had never even known existed. The elders, realizing they had been fooled by Bisi's lies, immediately stripped her of her position. The village had their true king now, and Bisi's reign was over. Obi stood by, watching everything unfold. He had no words, just a deep sense of dread. He had followed Bisi's path, thinking it would lead him to power and glory, but now he saw nothing but disaster ahead. The elders made a swift decision. Bisi and Obi were to be sent away, banished from the palace forever. Many villagers, furious with all the chaos Bisi had caused, demanded that she and Obi be sent to the evil forest, a cursed place where no one ever returned. The forest was known for its darkness, where spirits and dangerous creatures roamed freely, and banishment there was a death sentence. The people wanted justice for all the deaths and strange happenings that had plagued the village since Bisi's arrival. But Prince Moses, now the rightful king, stood up and made his first royal decree. Despite everything that had happened, he showed mercy. He told the elders that Bisi and Obi would not be sent to the evil forest. Instead, he ordered that they be pardoned and simply cast out of the palace to live as commoners with no power or influence. Though King Moses did not yet know the full extent of Bisi's evil deeds, his kind heart guided him to spare their lives. The villagers grumbled, unhappy with the decision. They had wanted revenge, but they dared not question the new king. Bisi and Obi, stripped of everything, were led out of the palace. The grandeur, the power, and the wealth they had once enjoyed were gone. Now they were nothing more than two outcasts, left to wander the village they had once ruled over. As they walked away from the palace gates, Bisi's eyes burned with rage. She had been defeated for now, but deep down she still harbored her dark powers. Obi, on the other hand, was consumed by regret. He had followed Bisi blindly, and now he had lost everything. The promises she had made to him were all lies, and he had been nothing but a pawn in her twisted game. The village, though relieved that their true king had returned, was still wary. They did not know what Bisi might do next, but for the moment they were content to see her and Obi removed from the palace. One evening, while Bisi was out of the house, Obi decided it was time to make his escape. The fear and regret had grown too strong for him to ignore any longer. He quietly packed his few belongings, careful not to make a sound. He knew that if Bisi found out what he was doing, his life would be in danger. Once his things were gathered, Obi ran as fast as his legs could carry him, heading for his maternal village, which was far away. He had no plan other than to get as far away from Bisi as possible. All he wanted was to escape her grasp and start a new life, far from the dark path he had been led down. When Bisi returned home later that evening, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. The house felt empty. She searched the rooms and found that Obi was gone. Her rage boiled over. Obi, the one person she thought she could control, had abandoned her. Furious, she stormed out of the house and made her way straight to the palace. She wasn't going to let anyone take power from her, not even the prince. At the palace, Bisi attempted to use her usual charm and cunning. She tried to seduce Prince Moses, hoping to regain control by manipulating him as she had done with so many before. But the prince was not like the others. He saw through her lies and refused to give in to her. This rejection infuriated Bisi. She had never been denied what she wanted, and the fact that Moses stood firm only made her more determined to take action. In a fit of rage, Bisi reached into her bag and pulled out a small, sinister object, something filled with dark magic. She was about to use it against the new king, intending to destroy him and take back the throne by all means necessary. But before she could cast her evil spell, something powerful hit her from behind, as if the spirits themselves had intervened. Bisi fell to the ground, her body lifeless. The palace guards and the elders rushed to the scene, shocked by what had just happened. They realized that Bisi's evil deeds had finally caught up with her. The villagers, who had long feared Bisi, were relieved to hear that she was no longer a threat. Her body, filled with dark magic and wickedness, was taken to the evil forest. There, it was buried deep within the cursed land, where no one would dare go. The village elders made sure she was placed in the most desolate part of the forest, ensuring that her spirit would never return to haunt the village again. With Bisi gone, the village could finally breathe easy. King Moses ruled with wisdom and fairness, restoring peace and harmony to the land. The people no longer had to live in fear, and slowly life returned to normal. The strange events that had taken place over the past years became stories that the villagers would pass down from generations to generations. This story teaches that no matter how powerful or cunning someone may be, evil deeds will eventually lead to their downfall. Bisi's greed for power and her deceitful ways brought harm to many, but in the end she could not escape the consequences of her actions. Obi too learned a hard lesson. Following the wrong path, even when it seems promising, can lead to great regret and loss. It is important to choose wisely and to stay true to one's values, for the pursuit of power and wealth through wickedness will only bring ruin in the end. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed this story, please like, share and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on notifications for more inspiring tales.